goodness, my laptop.
Morning, everybody. This is not the Mayday podcast with Julie Roginski and Michelle Kinney, but I couldn't figure out the assets without Michelle being here, so that's what we're getting as an intro. Hi, everybody. It's actually Julie Roginski and Olga Lautman.
Hi, I'm Olga, not Michelle.
This week's episode of Pax Americana, we are about an hour late, so I apologize. I had to rush over Olga to MS Now, which I told them specifically I could not do at 11, disregarded, and moved my hit time to 11:15, and so that's why we're late. So I apologize. But good to see you for this very abbreviated week of Pax Americana. I want to talk, Olga, first and foremost, two big stories coming out of Moscow today. The first is in the Wall Street Journal about the May Day parade. So just to set the scene, May 9th is Dzień Pobjedy, which is the victory over Nazi Germany and Russia. It is the holy grail of the Russian calendar. It is Christmas and Easter and pick your holidays times 10,000. It is truly the most important day in the Russian calendar. Understandably so. It is the day that Nazi Germany surrendered to the Soviet Union. It's a day after they surrendered on the Western Front. And if you ever knew anybody who lived through World War II, like my grandfather, he would put on his World War II medals every May 9th, even when he lived here, until the day he died. Literally every May 9th, all the people who served on the Eastern Front would do that, and you would respect it because of everything they went through. Ever since Putin came back to power 26 years ago now, he has even more made this day like the greatest day ever. That is part of his cult of personality of trying to rehabilitate Joseph Stalin so that he could basically try to emulate him in many ways. And of course, that was kind of the most unifying moment of Russia and the Soviet Union. So therefore, of course, that makes sense for him. I say that because this year, so there's always a May Day parade in Red Square. And whenever you see those pictures of tanks, it's not May Day, excuse me, May 9th, Victory Day parade, those tanks and missiles rolling through Red Square, that's where they show off the military hardware. I'm
laughing because every year I document on Twitter for a decade now of one of those tanks falling off, rolling over, or something smoking, or something going wrong. But yes, it is the biggest, and it's not only Moscow. I mean, every single city holds their mini version of this Victory Day parade.
But the big one is in Moscow, and
yes,
and I say all of this because this year it's a little unusual. It's a little odd. Vladimir Putin has been MIA. He has been hiding out. He is nowhere to be found. He has isolated himself even more. He is terrified of a coup internally. There was an article, I forgot where, it might have been the Times. There's Sergei Shoigu, his former, now national security advisor, former defense minister, who he kind of demoted, potentially could be creating some sort of coup structure against him. Who the hell knows? Nobody knows. We don't know. But what we do, and it's interesting that I doubt that Shoigu would do it, but you never know.
They arrested everyone around Shoigu for corruption over the past few years. Literally, like the deputy defense minister and all the Shoigu people embedded within the government have been arrested. Over 2 years now.
Shoigu is also not an ethnic Russian, and I think that would be problematic for him because that's it's a bit of a racist society. However, what is fascinating about this is that they are not doing the usual May 9th Victory Day parade. Putin's not going to be standing on top of, doing a review stand on top of Lenin's tomb, which is what they've always done. He's nowhere to be found. He's not going to be in Moscow reviewing the troops. And they are, first of all, I'm not sure how much infrastructure is going to be rolling through Moscow because it's all on the front in Ukraine, Olga. But second, Ukraine, to its credit, and has been taking it to the Russians, including in Moscow. They have shown that they have the assets and the capabilities to hit Moscow if they want. And despite Russia's much larger military, the drones that Ukraine has have penetrated Russian assets thousands of miles away. I mean, really far from Ukraine, really far from the front. And the other thing that I think is important to note is this is celebrating a victory over Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was obviously the greatest threat aside from Napoleon and the Mongol hordes that Russia ever faced. Certainly in living memory of people who either were there, who are now dying off, or their children, like my parents and their grandchildren. I mean, we all, if you're Russian, you carry that with you. You have tremendous respect for it. That war began in June of 1941 for the Russians. It ended in June of 1945. This war with Ukraine that was supposed to take 3 days has now gone on longer than it took the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. That is a really bad look for Vladimir Putin. It's not looking like it's resolving itself, which is why he had to beg for a ceasefire throughout this period, so that there wouldn't be more Russian casualties or potential attacks on Moscow or wherever these May 9th parades are, while they're celebrating the defeat of the Nazis, which of course is what they pretended that Ukraine is. So Olga, thoughts, comments, disagreements? What do you think?
So yes, they're definitely scaling back. They did do it a year before, not to this level. I think it was either not last year, not 25. It was in 2024. They also scaled back because they were worried about drones attacking Moscow. That was at a time. I don't know if you remember. There was a drone attack in Moscow. The flag on top of the Kremlin went on fire. And you had, like Russia very worried at the time. This year it's definitely worse, much, much worse. And like you said, this parade and just Victory Day, I mean, literally, this is shoved down everyone's throat, because this is like the only thing that I think the Soviet Union, and not just ethnic Russians, because people need to remember that it wasn't the Russians who defeated Nazis. It was, the Russians and Ukrainians and Georgians and Kazakhs. But Russia likes to omit that part of history and put that it's, Russia, Moscow that defeated the Nazis. But this is something that, is shoved down to such an unhealthy point of where this is where this exceptionalism and this, superiority of a race comes from. Like, this is like from kindergarten, they start hammering it.
Maybe I was brainwashed myself when I was there, and maybe I'm still a little bit brainwashed about it. I don't think we should diminish with the Soviet Union.
No.
The casualties of the Soviet Union, 20 million Soviets died. And I wanted to say this. If you go to Moscow and you come in from Sheremetyevo Airport, which was, I don't know if I think now is not the main airport that you fly into, but the last time I was in Moscow was the airport that we flew into. And you are, it's right outside Moscow, and actually it's in Moscow now, but you are on the road into Moscow proper, and you see a marker, and that is where the Nazi tanks stopped. It was right outside Moscow in the 1940s. It is now, Moscow's expanded, so now it's part of Moscow. I want to be very clear. People in Moscow, like my family, my grandparents on both sides, they never saw the Nazis there. First of all, they all fled east. Second, when they saw the Nazis approach, but second, the Germans never got to Moscow. They got to Ukraine. And the reason that I, as a Soviet Jew, am alive today is because my family happened to have been living in Moscow, and they were able to flee east. If my family had been Ukrainian, living in Kyiv, for example, I would not be alive today. And so every time the Russians talk about how this was the Russians and they did this, the people who suffered because of the geography, right? Ukraine's just further west, closer to Germany, closer to the Polish border. If you go to Ukraine, you go to a place called Babi Yar. Babi Yar is a ravine where they lined up all the Jews of Kiev and shot them all. It is a Holocaust level, Auschwitz level of horror. They literally lined them up outside a ravine and killed them all. And Babi Yar is now in Kiev proper. Back then it was right outside Kiev. The Russians bombed Babi Yar during this war to show you how little they actually give a shit about World War II or the memory of World War II when it comes to Ukraine, which really truly suffered immense loss. I mean,
That was one of the first targets in 2022 after the full scale invasion. That was one of the first targets. And I remember it was like, wow, Russia's really showing itself as it was, peddling this bullshit that, Ukrainians are Nazis. And this is why Russia needs to launch this full scale invasion. Here they, one of the most sacred sites they bombed. I was like very telling.
It would be the equivalent if they started. It would be the equivalent if they went to war against Poland, which could happen, of them bombing Auschwitz. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. It is a absolutely sacred site when it comes to the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, and I might add, the Soviets after World War II ended pretended it didn't happen. Just pretended it didn't happen.
And that's
go ahead.
It's
a very long time, and a very wonderful, poignant poem by a very famous Russian Soviet poet to call Babi Yar, which I'm not going to recite. If I do, I'll start crying. But it is the poem begins: "There are no monuments atop of Babi Yar," which is a big fuck you to the Soviet authorities that they just refused to acknowledge what happened there, even though it was the Nazis who did it. So when they bombed Babi Yar, the Russians, just remember that they did that as they celebrate on Saturday the May Day parade, the Victory Parade, which is, again, this coming Saturday, May 9th. Olga.
And that's why I say in an unhealthy, obsessive way, because if you look at anything, and follow Russian, monitor Russian, everything, I mean, Victory Day is like, and this defeat of the Nazis is like embedded in everything in society, not just May 9th. I mean, it's November 9th and June 11th. And I mean, I'm just throwing random days out, but this is just embedded in the psyche of the Russians. And whereas every other country who took very heavy losses, who at the time, unfortunately, was held hostage under the Soviet Union, they don't, they will honor it, they will respect it, they will do everything for it, but this is not embedded in their society. This is not drilled into their brain of why you're better than the rest of the world because you defeated the Nazis and your family died, defeating the Nazis. They pay their respects. They do everything. Obviously, if you're Ukrainian or Georgian or Kazakh or whoever you are, you will, your grandparents will be remembered, and anyone who fought in war is remembered and paid due respect. But it's not like in Russia. I mean, Russia Victory Day is like to another level because it's just embedded in absolutely everything across society. 365 days a year in the society. And that's why I say unhealthy, because obviously you're going to have a lot of countries honoring Victory Day. Russia will just, take it to a whole different level. But it is interesting that they are doing it. It shows, yet again, that they are worried that they can't protect Moscow. Ukrainians thus far have been excellent and frankly have, more, hey, call it, what is it called? Like they're being held back more because they're not going to bomb Moscow, suburbs and residential buildings like what Russia does every single day across all of Ukraine. They could. If Ukrainians wanted to, they could bomb all of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Belgorod, everywhere, and hit residential buildings, hospitals, and every other kindergartens. Russia just bombed a kindergarten and killed a mass amount of people in Sumy. Just the other day was almost 30 people dead. and Ukrainians have the restraint. They don't do this. They we Every attack we see is, specifically targeted at military or oil infrastructure or something that funds the war. With that said, and for Victory Day, like, they would not have to worry. Moscow wouldn't have to worry, and it just shows you the paranoia, because Ukrainians aren't going to go and start bombing, Muscovites attending a parade. I
Well,
mean, they can hit infrastructure maybe, or somewhere near, like maybe one of the intelligence buildings or military defense buildings, but they wouldn't go and start bombing that. And the fact that Russia's taking this much precaution and, frankly, basically ceasing exercise, not putting any equipment out, and really tightening it. Normally, this is like, Putin's time to, like, invite the creme de la creme across the globe. Xi came, I think, last year, and frankly, he invites everyone. He even invited Trump last year. To my shock, he actually didn't attend. This year, it's like 4 countries that he's inviting. I think Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. I think 4 countries. So they really, really scaled it down to a level that is very interesting, because, I mean, it'll be, it shows the paranoia building inside of Russia, and particularly inside the inner circle of Putin and his inner circle. Because, like I said, Ukrainians have the respect and the restraint. They would not go and start bombing random civilians, and especially with leaders from other countries there. I mean, this is just not how they operate, and
well,
that's it. But
speaking of military targets, because we don't have much time today, there is a Russian academic institute called the Bauman. I'm trying to think. It's basically a technical institute. It is the MIT of Russia. Truly an almost impossible university to get into. It's difficult to get into as MIT, and also in many ways is brilliant, filled with as brilliant people as MIT. Olga, you brought this to my attention. Why don't you tell people what's going on at the MIT of Moscow, the MIT of Russia these days?
So it's interesting, because universities is one of the key recruitment grounds in Russia. And today, an investigation came out by the Insider. It's actually a consortium of journalists. It was the Guardian, the Insider, I believe V Square from which is the Hungarian/Poland team. So it was a consortium of journalists. They received documents that this technical university has a department within the university, military department, where they recruit for Russia's military intelligence units, the GRU. And these are like recruitment for very specific units that are involved with, like, Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, the hacking units, also the assassination units, the assassination squads that I believe go back to 29155, and have been carrying for over a decade, have been carrying out assassination attempts and plots across Europe and whatnot. So it just shows you that this investigation, I suggest everyone go read it. You could Google the university and you'll see it. The Guardian definitely put it out. The Insider actually did it both in Russian and in English. And it just shows you to the extent of how Russia's, universities operate, because a lot of them are recruitment grounds. I mean, for when I do investigations for Russian operations, and, with potential Russian agents operating, like, my first thing is to look where they studied. And if they studied in Raniepo or Lomonosov or, certain universities, I'm like, oh, this is an SVR recruitment ground. This is an FSB recruitment ground. And here's like St. Petersburg. Putin when he came back from Dresden. At the time, it was Leningrad University, and it was under KGB control, and it was also a recruitment ground in St. Petersburg at the time for the KGB. And Putin worked there before he went to work at the mayor's office in St. Petersburg before he got into government. So this investigation is super, super fascinating because here they received the documents. So obviously it came from, I probably someone inside Russia, maybe European intelligence agencies, but more so I would believe with these amounts of details that it would come from inside Russia, which is another interesting indicator because since the full scale invasion, I can tell you, at least on the Ukrainian end, I'm not sure about other agencies, but on the Ukrainian end, there has been a trove of information being sold by security services in Russia. And the amount of information that has come out of Russia since 2022, like people don't even have enough time to process it. Like there's not enough people, and that just shows you another good point that there are people, not that they are not in line with the war, because frankly, if this war was profitable to a certain group or whatnot, they absolutely would be. But that this full scale invasion has disrupted certain units and certain groups within intelligence agencies, disrupted their flow of income. And that's that. So I urge everyone to check this out because it's a super interesting investigation done by Michael Weiss and others. And it very cool.
Yeah, it's a shame because again, you think about what kind of advances Russians. Listen, the periodic table was created by a Russian scientist, Mendeleev, right? Like you had Andrei Sakharov, who was the father of the nuclear program. You had scientists working on the space program and sent the first, the first, dog, Laika, the first dog in space, Yuri Gagarin, the first human to space. And so my grandfather worked in the first Sputnik. You had these incredible scientists in the history of Russia / the Soviet Union. I mean, you really, really did. The brain drain has gotten so awful and so bad that rather than creating and incubating these incredible scientists in Moscow at the Bauman Institute, they have now turned part of it over to intelligence because all this country is and has become, unfortunately, is just a cancerous thug nation that rather
it's the Chicka system. It's the Chicka. It's everything.
Bringing itself up is trying to bring everybody else down in the West. And it's just incredible because even during Stalin's worst time, he killed a lot of scientists, but you had a scientific program. You had people working on the nuclear program. Granted, they stole a lot from the Americans, but nevertheless, Sakharov was a brilliant, brilliant man and ended up, under house arrest for decades because of his views on the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, was a brilliant human being. And now, again, I keep saying my grandfather literally worked in the ventilation system for the first Sputnik, and he was, one of hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were part of the space program, who were scientists and engineers and so on. And it's just underscore. I mean, to me, this is kind of emblematic of what this country has become, where they have driven out anybody who massive brain drain going back to the Soviet days, the collapse of the Soviet Union, but instead of incubating their own people, their own scientists, their own engineers, they're outsourcing a lot of their war economy. Like, why are they buying Shahed drones from the Iranians? Is nobody in Russia capable of creating their own drones? Like, think about that. That's one. And two, when you take something like an MIT, imagine if MIT started, rather than incubating the greatest scientists in the country, started incubating people whose goal was to destroy other people's science programs, other people's. I mean, it is so sad and disappointing for a country that has the brain resources that it does, the natural resources that it does, the geographic resources that it does, all of that, and yet none of that is being put to good use. It is only being put towards waging war or threatening other countries or infiltrating other countries or creating havoc around the world. It is tragic, tragic if you come from the former Soviet Union, from Russia the way that I do. It is a tragedy. It is a tragedy for the Russian people who, unfortunately, have never known any better than one thug after another. But it is, it is what's happening right now. It's just, I don't know. What more can you say?
and and I come from a more dire view of it because I'm so stuck constantly in reading about various operations and this and that. I don't think that much has changed because honestly, yes, everything you said is 100% correct as far as the intelligence and the training and education. I mean, frankly, like literally, there's not one person who, went to school and doesn't have engineers in the family and whatnot. But at the same time, we cannot forget how cruel the Politburo was to people and the leadership. I mean, how many scientists were killed? How many closed cities were there across the Soviet Union where they were busy? Again, this is the Soviet Union. Instead of, looking to get their people off of food lines and not have them, like my mom when she lived there, like used to have to melt sugar for food and then eat sugar, like liquid sugar, and this was like part of her meal. And she came from a more reasonable family. My grandmother was a scientist. And there it's interesting because again, on the Ukrainian side, different mentality and different way, but there you had all these closed cities that were like bioweapon and chemical weapon, institutes that didn't exist, and that every intelligence service on the planet was trying to get their hands on. And what were they doing? Developing like the most lethal bioweapons and chemical weapons and everything to destroy everything. And then, after the scientists were done, with whatever invention of their bioweapon or super secret chemical weapon program, they would be murdered because they knew too much. And Putin brought that practice back. I mentioned it. I think for our hey, call it the Americans rewatch, for anyone who
Mhm.
hasn't tune in because it's super interesting with the illegal program and the American show. But I mentioned there that Putin has brought this practice back of how you call it arresting scientists, charging them for treason because they know too much. And the same thing, like, with under Brezhnev, which is what my parents lived under. Um, he was one of, I mean, this started under Stalin, but he was one of the leaders who most employed, anyone who questioned anything, calling them, schizophrenic and putting them into mental institutes. Well, Putin brought this back, around the Navalny protest in 2017-18, and then started ramping up the program to the point that anyone, to send a message to others, anyone who speaks out or questions anything, goes to a protest or writes a post, ends up in a psychiatric ward being injected with drugs. So, for me, Putin, I think, is bringing back a lot of the programs, a lot of the tactics, and a lot of the methods that existed in the Soviet Union, and literally combining everything between Lenin and Stalin and Brezhnev, like the worst of the worst. No wonder he despises Gorbachev. He didn't take anything from him. Um, but Gorbachev actually was on a higher level than the rest of them. But the rest of those, thuggish leaders, I mean, they use the worst tactics to keep people in line, infiltrating scientific communities, infiltrating art, all the cultural events and communities. And I mean, every single thing. If someone painted and it was against the state, they would be, thrown into a gulag. So I think personally, Putin is just bringing the worst back, of what it was. And it kills me. It's sad because Russia actually did have a chance after collapse in the early 90s. I always said if the West didn't come in with suitcases of cash and basically end up giving this money to mafia and the FSB at the time, the KGB FSB, maybe there would have been a way where democracy could have developed. But then it just, sadly got too corrupted. And then you had, Yeltsin and then Putin come and like I say, I call it the Chakot system because I mean it really is like the Secret Service and like the security. It is a security state in every aspect. Universities, the church, the opera center, like every single thing you touch, security services has their hands in and are either monitoring or
And I just want to
doing.
point something out here, which is, and I know we have to go, but pointing something out here, which is that the United States is trending in the same direction under Trump. They have infiltrated the media. They have infiltrated the universities. They have infiltrated every cultural institution. You saw what happened at the Met Gala on Monday, where you had the Bezoses buying, basically the chairing of the Met Gala, despite the fact that Anna Wintour used to be a very strong Democrat. You have them taking over tech, what I call soft power, right? And Hollywood to some extent. And so what you're seeing is that system happening here. We have a very limited amount of time to stop it.
It's frightening. You're 100% correct.
You see what happens at CBS. The same crew is about to take over CNN, which is why Scott Jennings is allowed to say and do whatever he wants, unlike everybody else in television. Literally everybody else in television could not drop the F-bomb and not get kicked off the air. So I just want to be very clear about what's going on here, because it's not just Russia. Russia is the precursor to what could potentially happen here. And as much as we say, well, we have elections and we have so on and so forth, we have the Constitution, so do they. Okay, on that note,
Yes.
you got to run.
Yes. Yeah. And I just want to add one more thing. People don't pay as much attention, but this is exactly what happened in Russia in the 90s, where the government started taking percentages in companies. And you see Trump doing the same thing, whether it's Intel, he wanted to take 90% of Spirit Airlines, that didn't happen. But if you notice, keep an eye on that, because this is extremely frightening, because this is in, a capitalist system. This is now the same system operating with cronyism and kleptocracy, and, where the government puts their fingers into every single industry, all the big companies and whatnot, and literally take stakes of it. It's, we're not too far off where then you start having leadership change, and there will be, all Trump people who start replacing and whatnot. And this is exactly how it happened in Russia in the 90s. So, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So on that note, we have our newest episode of the Americans podcast coming out tonight. So please tune into the meeting for that. So if you haven't watched, by the way, either the Americans or a podcast, watch the Americans. It's such a good show. Go back and look at our podcast. You could start from episode 1. We're up to episode, I think tonight is episode 6 that's dropping, maybe 7. I can't remember. So you're not that far behind. Watch it. We talk a lot about a lot of this stuff, about all of this in much more kind of cultural terms. So you can catch that over on YouTube on the Media Network for those of you who are watching us in Substack tonight or today. And other than that, Olga, I think we're back next week at our regular 11 a.m. hour. I'm so sorry for having to move it by an hour today. And I am always so, so grateful to everybody who tunes in to this. This is one of my favorite shows to do all week, because I love talking about this stuff. To anybody who,
Me too.
Yeah, to anybody all across the United States and Europe, tomorrow is VE Day here and in Europe. Saturday is VE Day in the former Soviet Union, and I mean not just Russia, but Ukraine and Belarus and all the other all former 15 republics. So to anybody who lived through that, even if you were a small child, thank you for paving the way for us. And on that note, Olga, I will see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.